I'm David Glenn Taylor. Welcome to the Voyagers Podcast. Ah, vino. Of all the beverages, brews, and distillations concocted by man, is there anything that compares to wine? The history, the depth, the artistry. I had a professor in college that told me that people always feel before they think, and I can think of no better example of that for me than what I feel when I open a bottle of wine and take a first sniff. I feel nostalgia, excitement, relaxation, all that before I've even tried to nail down what exactly I'm smelling. Is that sage? A hint of tobacco and currant? Is that plum or cherry? Then I sip, and the body of the wine, the feel, and the finish, it's all so romantic. For this, the inaugural episode of the Voyagers podcast, I wanted to introduce you to a friend. Since the Voyagers is a podcast that will be built around friendship, kindness, and conversations with people who are working to make the world better, I thought I'd start by talking to one of the kindest and most intelligent people I know. I first met Mark Beaman at our kids' school in the upcountry region of the island of Maui in the state of Hawaii where I live. At the time, Mark was the head winemaker at Maui Wine in Ulupalakua, the only vineyard and winery on the island. We became friends quickly. We had a lot in common. We both spent time in Africa, both spoke a little Swahili. We both loved the water, though his surfing level was far above mine. We were both dads of boys, which we can talk about for days. But Mark, he had this magic key to a world I was dying to know more about. These days, Mark is at Beringer Wines in Napa, California. His primary responsibility are the vines themselves, tending to them, making sure they're healthy, keeping them in their best producing state. Recently, he took some time off from the vines to sit down to have a conversation about winemaking. What's your official title? What is the title there?
Swiss Army knife.
I believe that. I totally believe that because, I get to watch you work a little bit at Maui Wine, and I know that the jack of all trades thing is kind of down your alley.
Yeah, the title that I've got is Harvest Winemaker. So it's specific to more of the tasks that occur during the winemaking process that happens during harvest.
Right.
So
before I'm gonna get into your story in a little bit and stuff like that, but let's just I just wanted to ask you, why wine?
Why not?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
there's a million beverages out there, right? That you could have been making.
There are,
you could have been making beer. You could have been doing. Why is wine your thing? Where did it come from? Where was the inspiration for that?
I think it's because it was a combination of things that I grew up with, being agriculture. It was science, which I've always been into, and my parents certainly were inspirations for that as well. And then it was a type of profession that was just growing in Washington State. And when I returned from my travels overseas, I'd been away from home for a while. Right. And so, you kind of come back with a new light on how you see things because you've been gone for a little while. You see other stuff. And the wine industry had just exploded in Washington State where I grew up at. And I thought, wow, this is it. It's something that's up and coming. So there's stability within the profession. And then it scratches the itch of the science and the science background that I had, both, as I mentioned, from my parents and my upbringing, but also from what I actually graduated from college in. So it's that thing where it's like, I went to school for 4 years. I probably ought to use that somehow. So,
yeah, no, you gotta use it.
It really fit all the pieces. And there were some inspirations kind of along the way that I maybe didn't realize it at the time, but it was sort of leading me towards being into the wine world.
You went to college for wine making?
No, I did not actually. No, I don't have the standard pedigree, if you will. Most winemakers they either come from a winery family, they live in California in wine country, they go to either UC Davis or they go to Fresno and they get a degree and they just know what they're doing. That wasn't me. I was a wanderer, and I came from a pretty humble background in a farming community in Washington State where there was wine around, but it wasn't something that I was really into. And so when I went to college, I was originally thinking of engineering, and then I hung out with some engineers and I realized that's just not me, man.
I've known a few engineers. We're going to have an engineer on the podcast here in a few weeks, actually.
No, they're great. You're great. No,
Ricky Smart.
Yeah. But once I kind of got a little more into classes and started to find my path of what I preferred, geology really sang to me.
Yeah.
So
geology.
probably partly because the field trips were great.
Well, okay, so here's the question for you then. Okay, because when it comes to wine, I mean, my experience with wine was kind of funny. I got married young, right? And my wife and she was 19, I was 21, so we didn't even have wine at our wedding, and so we didn't know anything about wine. And stop me if you've heard this before, because I'm sure you have, in terms of like,
no, go for it, man.
Well, there's a gateway into wine, right? Like most of us as adult experiences, like everybody who'd be listening to this everyone listening to this would say, this was the first time I tasted wine, and it was probably like a Beringer white Zinfandel, right? Or something.
Good chance.
Like that, right? That was right?
The gateway.
It's the gateway. We were young, and we first tasted the kind of white Zinfandel, and then you slowly. Here was my story. I didn't know anything about wine, but somehow I had tasted. I don't know how it's something. There were like a $5 bottle of white Zinfandel from Beringer or whatever, and I got that, and I drank it. And I was like, wow, it's super sweet, and I was like, I like this. I like this, and also I got the wonderful feeling of slightly more sophisticated that I was drinking wine, right? So I was probably 23, 24, in there. And then we were on a trip. We lived in Alaska at the time. We were on a trip back to the Northwest to see my family, and I'm down there, and we went to a restaurant, and my wife and I were alone. Some grandparents were watching the kid, and I didn't know that Zinfandel was a grape. Didn't know that at all. Sure. And so I asked the guy to bring me a Zinfandel. And I just thought that was like a brand, and then I got this glass of red wine, this big bowl of red wine, and I had to choke it down. And I remember at the moment going, I have no idea what I'm talking about.
I think your experience is very similar to so many people where, all the time people come in and maybe will ask for a white Zinfandel, and you give them a red wine or whatever, like at the tasting room, and they're like, that's not what I expected. Right. It's like, okay, but that sort of opens the door to conversation, as long as situations like that, when they occur, are people have grace and say and patience to be like, oh, here's an opportunity to educate someone. And as long as you don't come off sanctimoniously, you can educate somebody, which I think is a big draw to being in the wine world for me, because you learn something new all the time.
Because the wine world is never snobby like that, right? It's just
hell yeah, it is.
So, do you have a story like that? Like where how did you? I mean, remember the first time you tasted wine?
Yeah, I actually can. So I did a study abroad in Adelaide, Australia.
How old were you?
I was, I would have been 19 years old.
Right.
19 years old, but the drinking age over there was 18. So we were able to go into bars, and it was crazy because you'd see kids trying to sneak into the bar that just looked like children. They're like 16 years old. So it was strange. But the bar culture, if you've ever been in Australia, is just brilliant. There's so much fun, practical jokers, and it's a very lively environment. And so I had become a member of the footy team for the college that we were at. We played that day. We got just absolutely trounced, and I was terrible. I also probably had a bit of a target on my back because I was an American. The team, we all went out afterwards to the pub to go drink, and the opposing team was there, and it was like no hard feelings, just drinks going around. And we partied hard that night, and we ended up drinking all the beer that pub had. There was like nothing left. And so, there was nothing left, man. They're like, we're out, man. And I wouldn't say we drank it all. It just, maybe they had a busy night. Maybe they missed a shipment.
I've had a few beers with some Aussies. They could put it back, man.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just so much fun. And so the bartender's like, well, I guess that's it for you guys. And we're like, we're not going to do spirits. We know well enough that you don't do spirits after beer. And he's like, well, I do have some wine. And I'm like, we were like, oh, okay, sure. And it wasn't, it was port. It was fortified. So this stuff, most wines that you drink are anywhere from 13 to 15% alcohol, Whereas port, being fortified with spirits to stop the fermentation and keep it sweet, and then bring the alcohol level up, that can be anywhere from 19 to 21% alcohol.
Right.
So it's got some power to it, but it's sweet, so it can kind of trick you. And so that's how we ended our evening, was with very warm glasses of port, and the hangover was horrendous the next day. So I was like, no more of that for me for a while.
No more wine. You just swore it off.
Yeah, I didn't have an interest in it. When I joined Peace Corps after graduating from college, I went to Tanzania, to East Africa, and you and I have spoken about African experience, because you spent some time in Kenya too, which was just amazing. And the local beverage that they have there is they just call it pombe, which just means booze, basically. So it's fermented anything. And in the village that I was in Getagul village, it was fermented like corn, and it was thick, and it was almost like you'd probably want a straw with a filter in it, because it just was really mealy, and it was not pleasant at all.
Right.
And I had no interest in that. So there was a local guy, and his name was Lucas Ngoe, and he sold mead, so honey wine, and they call it asali, which is the same term for honey, but it's asali a pombe, so it's alcohol. And he was just like a fundi, the guy that could like fix things and was very good at it, an expert, kind of a journeyman of it. And he'd ride around on his bicycle, and he'd have a 5-gallon bucket on the back of it, and you could buy it by the cup or buy a gallon or whatever you wanted. And his stuff was just the best around. He got cloves from Zanzibar that he'd infuse into it, so it had a little bit of spice to it. And he was very proud of his product. Wow. And he and I became friends, and he kind of taught me some of his little secrets. He's like, yeah, go get some honey, and this is what you do. And he showed me a few tricks, and I took some interest in it. And then fast forward to a year into my service, my parents came to visit me, and along with my grandmother, who was just recently widowed. And my grandfather was just an amazing adventurer. We decided, hey, let's invite everybody out to the village at the beginning of this time, and we'll throw a party. And my grandmother was treated like an absolute queen, because she was like probably 80, 81 years old at that time. And the average life expectancy in Tanzania is probably maybe 48 or 50 years old. Right. So elders are very well respected. And so she was met with like a lot of honor, which was great for her. And so, but the party was an absolute dud, man. My parents and my grandmother didn't speak Swahili, and most of the villagers didn't speak English. So it's like these two groups that I really wanted to meet, with my friends that I made in Tanzania and the heads of the village. Nobody could talk to each other because there wasn't any common language that they shared. Right. And then Lucas showed up with the honey wine, and everybody started to drink it and have a good time and turn up the music. And pretty soon, I think people started to speak common language. And that moment always kind of stuck with me, that, wow, this guy just brings good times. And there's a power that's in that. Yeah. That really to this day still sticks to me. And it's kind of like playing Dionysus a little bit, it's bringing the good times. So, I saw power in that. And then when I came back, when I came back from Peace Corps, I worked for the National Park Service for a while on Cumberland Island in Georgia, doing a mapping project for kind of sea turtle conservation work. So it felt very high and mighty, kind of like after the Peace Corps feeling of saving the world. It fit right in. Once that ended, I had to go back home and get a job to earn money. And so I worked for an irrigation company for a while, which was great. It was a family friend. And I kind of got back into the mindset of you have a career and you go for it. Right. Then my stepdad said, hey, let's find something else for you. And so he opened up a newspaper, and he's like, there's a lot of wineries hiring for harvest. He encouraged me to go apply at Columbia Crest Winery, which is the largest winery owned by Chateau Ste. Michelle in Washington State. Got a haircut and put on a tie and drove up to interview with them, and they took pity upon me. I didn't have quite the credentials that maybe they were looking for. I did have a good work ethic, and I had a science background. And so they hired me very low on the totem pole to work harvest, where I was just checking the sugars on the trucks as they would come across the scales, because a lot of the fruit was purchased. They didn't own all of their vineyards. They owned quite a bit. But when you're purchasing fruit from a grower, there's criteria that the grower needs to meet. And it's tonnage, It's quality of fruit, and oftentimes the quality of fruit is measured in terms of sugar content, or bricks, as we call it, which is the soluble solids. Because there's a correlation at about 60% of the sugar content is going to convert into alcohol.
Right.
So they wanted to have that analysis right off the bat before they even crushed and accepted the fruit. So
what are you out there like pounding a grapes into squeezing grapes into a thing? And then taking
no, not on the scale of this place. They actually had a machine, and it was an Italian model, and it was like playing a video game, David. It was so cool. They had a little controller, and the truck would pull up, and you'd have him stop, and he'd be on the scale, and then this device, which was basically a boom with hydraulic bits to it that could lever itself out over the top of the truck and then drop a probe down into the grapes.
Yeah.
And it would grind up the grapes just like a small amount.
Yeah.
And bring maybe a 2-gallon bucket worth of juice, and it would suck it up with a pump and run it through an analyzer that would produce the sugar and the acidity right on the spot. And then it would spit out a piece of paper. I'd look at it and say, yep, you meet the criteria. And I'd hand that back to the driver, and then he'd be able to go crush his grapes and get approved. So it was
cool. First job in wine was probing trucks.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much.
Sticking a probe into a truck.
Yeah, pretty much. I thought I was just playing a video game or something.
Right.
It was just it was a lot of fun.
When I first met you, you're a head winemaker out at Maui Wine here on the island, and I got
Correct.
Yes. I think the first time you say, "Hey, I come down to the wine, to the winery and just come hang out and I'll show you around or whatever," and I was like, "Oh, cool," So I come walking into your lab, and I'm totally kind of blown away by the scienciness of it all, because I'm sitting there looking at beakers and little glass twirly things and things steaming and a freaking microscope, and I'm going, what is it? Because like the romance of wine, my wine experiences up to that point were like Italy and Greece and going into an old musty farmhouse and tasting wine with cheese and meats and stuff like that, and it was such an eye-opening experience to go. And then of course we have freaky smart people doing this stuff. Of course we do. And there has to be science to be, especially when you're making wine on really large scales, right? In terms of like being able to quality control that stuff. But for you, where's the romance in it? Like, does it get stripped away?
No, it's all through the process. Now, there's certain places that you could go to. Perhaps you see the type of technology that at first glance, maybe it's like, oh, okay, that kind of takes away from it. Or,
sure,
it seems like it would take away the romance, because it's not just all intuition and risk taking and Lucille Ball type stuff. But I think it's all relative, because do you go back and do you drink white Zinfandel? Not that there's anything wrong with that, David. I won't judge.
Love the Beringer white Zinfandel. No,
of course you do.
No, it's funny. It's funny. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I'm gonna tell a romance wine story. And then I want to hear. I want to hear Mark Beaman's romantic wine story. I want to hear one of the stories that you have about moments where you were just going, I love that I do this for a living, and I love
yeah, absolutely,
this setting.
You first though.
My wife and I, after we had finished college, we drove down from Alaska. She took a job as a nurse in a Native American hospital in Gallup, New Mexico. And so it was over her birthday. We dropped off our son, and we only had the one son at the time, and dropped off at grandma's house in Portland. We drove down to Las Vegas, and we went to this hotel, and we were staying at the Venetian Hotel, and it was her birthday. So we're going to a nice restaurant called Lutece, and it was a French restaurant. I'd never had French food before at that point. And at this point, I'm 27.
Yeah, it's been mind-blowing.
Yeah, well, I did. Yeah, I did. Yeah, and I really didn't. I want to say we were still, Marie and I both were like, hadn't experienced a whole lot of the world, and hadn't done a lot of, and we had traveled a lot on our own. But here we were, and we went to this fancy restaurant. She was beautiful in this beautiful dress, and I'm wearing a suit, and we get in there, we sit down. I think now the waiter probably was like, oh, geez. And because we were just smiling ear to ear, because we're just like, this is an amazing place. I think I told you this story before about how we walk into a restaurant and we're waiting and the gal, and we walk in, there's no waiting room. You walk into this place. I don't think this restaurant exists anymore at the Venetian, but you'd walk in and there's just a wall, and the wall kind of curves down a hallway to the right, curves down a hallway to the left. And there's this lady and she says, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, welcome. Your table's almost ready. If you could just hold on for one moment, we'll bring you in a second. And I said, great. And then this manager kind of appears out of nowhere and he's like, welcome to the restaurant, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. While we're waiting, can I show you something? It's my masterpiece. Okay. He walks us like, I don't know, 5 feet down to the left. And then he says, he kind of crouches down and he says, down here. We crouch down and there's a gap between the floor and the wall into the wall, like of about maybe, I don't know, 18 inches. And it just kind of it's kind of an inset gap in the wall. And we're kind of looking under it and looking through it. And inside the inset, in the floor is glass. And underneath the glass, you see like 1,000 tiny little rubber men holding up the glass, holding up the floor. And he's just showing this and he's just, isn't this incredible? And my wife looks at me and she goes, yeah, and I said, yeah, wow, this is incredible. And we're trying, and I still to this day, I gotta believe now that I know how young we were, 27 and 25, he was probably completely pulling our leg, but there it was. There was this total like art piece, weirdest thing. And then right then, the lady, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, your table's ready. So she takes us to our table. We end up, we're just smiling from ear to ear. We did not stop smiling. We don't know anything about the food, but the waiter he said, what would you like to drink with your meal? And, because I'd ordered I think we ordered Chateaubriand or something like that. And I said, I'll have a glass of red wine, whatever you recommend. And he says, you'll be having the blah, 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 blah. And I have no idea what it was. And then and then same thing he did with Maria, and it was the most intense, like, we're about to do a thing that the guy said that we're going to do, and he recommended it, and I don't even know what's coming, and it's going to be exciting. And for whether it was a psychosomatic thing, like I've totally convinced my brain this is going to be amazing, or the wine was just that good, and maybe that was it. I sat down and they this glass of wine and this Chateaubriand and the food and the atmosphere and the beautiful woman and it was just amazing. And I was hooked after that. I was hooked on good wine. I just didn't know that because the next time I bought a bottle of wine, it was horrible. And then I was like, oh, now I have to learn about wine because or else I'm going to spend a lot of money. You know what I mean? That was the moment for me that I was like, now I have to learn how to do this. And so I slowly kind of been building up. But that's my story. That was my first that was my entrance into the world of kind of good wine, I guess you could say. Now,
brilliant. And you've been there ever since, man.
Well, I've gotten better. I've got a lot of wine stories now, but I've got a few wine stories about you and some of the wine that you've shared with our family. I can tell those stories all day, but I want to hear an actual story about wine from a winemaker who is a science guy. Because I remember when you and I watched a wine movie together. Remember, we watched a French wine movie together here under the stars. And it was a wonderful movie about family.
That was BS.
I know. It was so funny because after the movie was kind of a tearjerker, and it was about this family, and their father died, and after the movie's over, we're like, oh wow. And I said, yeah. And Maria says, what did you think? I said, oh man, that was really beautiful and just such a touching story. And I think I turned to you and said, what did you think, Mark? And you were like, well, some of the wine techniques were gonna. And then Kate goes whack, and she just smacked you. It's like,
I know. Sometimes it's hard to. It's tough to turn it off sometimes because. Like I'll go to parties and people like, oh, you're a winemaker, and it's like, oh, okay, here, what do you think of this?
Right.
And my brain sometimes I've got to switch it off where it's like, oftentimes at work, you're looking for beauty, but you're also looking for potential flaws. Right. And then what you need to do to maybe massage the wine during the fermentation, or maybe pressing it off a little bit early to retain some of the softness before the tannins take over. And there's constantly just trying to all right, psychoanalyze this wine and make the best decision you possibly can. Because somebody put it together. There's between 1,800 and 3,000 potential decisions that you can make from when you pick it to when you finally put it into bottle. And you can even decide oh, I want to wait and I want to release this after 2 years worth of bottle time. So there's still those decisions to make. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's hard to turn that thing off. But to get back around to your kind of the wine story thing, I didn't start off that way. I was just I had an understanding of what the laboratory analysis needed to be done. And sort of an idea of what that meant to the winemakers, but it wasn't until I moved from Washington down to California. I only did one harvest in Washington. Man, it was cold. I didn't see the sun for probably like 6 days straight, because I'd show up before the sun came up and I'd go home after it had already gone down. The company, Stimson Lane, who owned Chateau Ste. Michelle and Columbia Crest in Washington, also owned wineries down in California. They would Villa Mount Eden and Con Creek, which is on the Silverado Trail, which is right next to Stag's Leap and some of these incredible wineries that have been around for forever. They ended up hiring me to do some more laboratory work and be a little bit more involved in the enology side of things. So some of the simple bits of winemaking. And I got to actually sit down and work with the winemakers very, very closely. And they were very open about sharing ideas and secrets. It wasn't like this covered up society, Bohemian Grove kind of thing, where they're not going to let you in and let you know what's going on in there, but you're really curious to know.
To cut off a finger, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows? But one of the first wine tastings that I got involved in, it was a blind tasting, and they said, "Oh yeah, we're going to do a blind tasting." And so I was like looking around for a bandana to put over my eyes, because I thought we actually had to wear something over our eyes so we couldn't see. And so one of the assistant winemaker was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I got to go find a blindfold. I mean, I didn't know to bring that." And he's like, "You're an idiot. No, what a blind tasting is they just put a bag over the bottle and then mix them up, and then you taste them so that you can't see what the label is. But you're supposed to actually look at the wine and analyze it for its color and the legs and all that, and then smell it and taste it, and then write down your thoughts." I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that makes more sense. I was afraid I was going to break glasses and stuff anyway. So I sat down and we tasted through the first flight. I remember it to this. It was in 2001, and it was a flight of Sangioveses. So Sangiovese made in Napa from, I think, 3 years prior. So they would have been probably 98, which was a good year. And then just so we're clear, from Tuscany.
So we're clear for some of the audience members, we don't want to presume that everybody knows Sangiovese. This is me at 25.
Yeah.
Sangiovese is a grape.
Correct.
Yes.
Sangiovese is a grape, and its origins are most well known in Italy, and it is, if you drink Chianti, you're drinking Sangiovese. So it's named for the region oftentimes in Europe, rather than the name of the actual variety of the grape. So you think of apples, there's Fuji, there's Gala, there's all sorts of different ones, but they're all still apples. And in the wine world, of course, there's different varieties that are out there that are still grapes, Vitis vinifera, but they have different color, they have different tannin, they have different flavors and aromas that come from them, mostly based upon the skin that's there. And Sangiovese is known to make a highly ageable wine, but also something that can be enjoyed when it's very, very young. So the tasting that I was involved in was to evaluate if the Sangiovese that the winery I was working at was of quality and could, punch in its weight class for other wines that were a similar price from around the world that were maybe more famous or maybe even more expensive. And so it was fascinating. The wines were all through the gamut of what was there, but I didn't have the vocabulary built up at that stage yet to describe them. Nowadays I could write a soliloquy on wines because I've got the encyclopedia of terms to go with to describe it. But I didn't at the time. But I found something that I was comfortable with in as a way to describe something as an analogy. So I used music instead. So I compared the different wines to different styles of music. And I recall one of them I wrote, it's like Carlos Santana Unplugged. It was very spicy, but kind of light and lower in terms of volume. It wasn't very loud and obnoxious and in your face. And then there was another one that was a bit more Grateful Dead, I would call it, which was pretty feral and kind of wild and very loud and a little bit disjointed perhaps. And so at the end of it, the winemakers all share like, all right, what did you think of this wine? How did you describe it? And I think they thought I was amusing or quaint because I was using these terms. And they said, we're going to keep doing this often and you're going to build up your vocabulary over time. And that was absolutely true. It became this very, very fun thing to know it smells like this certain sort of thing. So I know what happened to the wine maybe happened 3 years ago. So it's these little glimpses into the past by utilizing your senses.
Yeah.
And we've become such visual kind of creatures these days. Everything is so based on like what it looks like and what we see with media and technology, that the wine world, one of the many things I love about it is it slows us down to be more sensual creatures, to be honest. We stop working so much with our eyes, but we start to utilize our nose and our sense of taste. And even there's some tactile things, and it's very pleasurable to kind of delve into those hedonistic sort of senses that I think sometimes we forget to utilize as well as we can. Now and then you can kind of get a picture of what maybe happened then with that vintage. And then if you're able to talk with a winemaker and say, hey, I noticed this about this wine that was different maybe from the prior year's bottling. What was different about it? And then they can go back in time and tell you.
And that was the fascinating thing about meeting you, is that I hadn't, at to that point, I had never actually talked with a winemaker and then tasted the wine that they made. And I remember you came to Thanksgiving with your family and brought this incredible bottle of wine and told this whole story about it. And, it was so, and then going out to the winery and kind of getting to see all the kind of behind the scenes, but then sitting with you and actually drinking your wine was such a lovely thing. And I always had this kind of thing in my head that thought, I wonder if he's even enjoying this. Does he enjoy it? Do you enjoy it? Is it, but I've seen, so
hopefully there's no doubt about that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, like, can you name some of the bottles you've had over the years that just really stand out and you go, that was
absolutely. Yeah.
Like what?
Yeah. Well, I'll try not to pick ones that I made, because it just,
you
self-serving, but
you can.
Okay, well, I'll do two then. So one was a wine where I actually went back to my college, Whitman College in Washington State, to speak as a guest speaker to a wine seminar that the college had put together. Walla Walla's got a huge wine industry these days, and it's just exploded. And so, I kind of treated it as a vacation. I got to speak for 30 minutes, and I got to spend 3 days tasting all these great wines and attending all the other seminars. Awesome. So there were a lot of these wineries that hadn't really come and become famous yet, that were there, that I was able to taste, particularly before their prices went through the roof. And one really, really stood out to me. It was made by this Frenchman, Christophe Baron, and he actually comes from a Champagne family back in France. And he wanted to grow Burgundy. He wanted to grow Pinot Noir, the grape variety, probably somewhere in Oregon. But it never really kind of came together for him until he found this vineyard that used to be, well, it wasn't a vineyard, rather. Became his vineyard. That was an old derelict cherry orchard that was right next to the drive-in movie theater that I used to go to as a kid. Drive-in movie theater has kind of gone away now. And what was remarkable about it was just stones, like 100 feet deep. There was no soil whatsoever to speak of. But there's a very, very famous vineyard in France called Châteauneuf-du-Pape that is well renowned for having this type of soil, and they call them galettes for the stones. And they're rounded river rock that is from the basalt of the basaltic flows that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago in that particular area, which kind of dominates the landscape of southeastern Washington. He was like, this is where I'm going to plant my vineyard, and I'm going to grow the same varieties that they would grow in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So it's going to be Syrah and Grenache and Mourvèdre, red varieties that do well in that type of environment. And people told me, you're crazy. There's no soil there. What's going to grow? Weeds don't even grow here.
Right.
And he's like, the vines will find a way. He talked about mycorrhizae and the symbiotic relationship that this fungus that's in the soil or around rocks creates with the grapevine. And grapevines are good at getting water and some basic nutrients like potassium and phosphorus and those things, but they're very poor at getting things like zinc and some of the other micronutrients that are essential for good vine vitality and thus good fruit. Well, the mycorrhizae are really quite adept to drilling into rocks and breaking those down and absorbing those micronutrients. And then in return, they'll inject it into their host, being the grapevine root system. The grapevine root system will give them excess carbohydrates, which the mycorrhizae are not good at getting. So everybody gets a little bit of something. And this guy, Christoph, was explaining, it's like, you need good mycorrhizae in your soil. And this was really speaking to me, because when I was in Peace Corps, I was trying to convince the villagers and that the soil is a living, breathing thing. And there's little tiny microscopic bugs that are in there, and you need to nurture them to be able to have a good and healthy crop. People's minds were like, the soil's living? No, it's not.
Right.
So he was really preaching to the choir, and then he's like, all right, now I'll pour you the wines. He wasn't going to let me taste anything until he explained this. And my mind blew with how crazy these wines were. They were very wild, very feral. They weren't fruit, even though fruit's nice. Black cherries and blackberries, those are pretty and they're lovely, but sometimes they're a bit pedestrian.
Sure.
You can see them oftentimes in many other wines. These wines, they smelled like crazy things like beef jerky and seaweed and like craisins, and the descriptors were just off the wall, and they're very, very gamey and very wild and completely unforgettable. And so the wines are called Cayuse, and now there's, I think, a 3-year waiting list just to be able to buy a wine from him.
What?
They go for.
I was about to say, it's like, where? Okay, let's write this down. Where are we?
Yeah.
You really?
Well, I've got a few bottles in the cellar.
Are you kidding me?
No, because years later, I found out that he got some help with the vineyard and finding the vineyard location from one of the professors at the college I was at, Kevin Pogue, who's very renowned for just being a soil guy and being able to find great locations for where to grow grapes throughout the United States. And so Kevin Pogue was one of my professors, and awesome guy, rock climber guy, and just outdoorsman and really fun. And he had me come and speak at one of his classes that he was teaching years later. And then he's like, hey, let's go out to Cayuse and we'll go see this place. And so we went out there and we tasted out of the barrel, and he walked around the vineyard and he was showing me like, hey, I just bought this horse, and he's got these massive, like, it's not a Clydesdale, but it's a similar type horse. And he's taught it to walk like a model, where it's take one step in front of the other so it doesn't crush the vines off to the side. And the wines were just as spectacular as they could be. I mean, the level of effort and the care that this person put in to everything. You taste the wines, and the wines are beautiful, but then I think if you're aware and you're cognizant of the effort that this person put into it, you can't help but just elevate the pleasure that you take in tasting it, knowing that this was not something that came together very easily. Right. This took a lot of work, and I think that's really part of the beauty of the wine world, is that it's not like making Coca-Cola at all. There's so many things that can go wrong, and you're at the mercy of Mother Nature. Right. And you can be very intervening if you wanted to be with technologies and techniques. But I think the approach that I've been kind of leaning towards, and I've seen many other winemakers that I respect go towards as well, is trying to create as natural of a product as possible. And that doesn't always mean it's going to have its fans, because people have very specific things that they enjoy taste-wise. But it is my responsibility as a winemaker to create a product that represents authenticity to the land. Sure. Whether people like it or not, that's for them to decide, because opinions vary. But I think the consumer deserves an opportunity to try something authentic for themselves.
That's the tricky part when it comes to, as a novice, I go into the store and there's just a billion wines there. And being a design guy, we often we pick by the label, right? If it's a nice label, whatever, we get curious.
Sure.
That way. Most people, I don't know if you would agree with this statement, but most people are looking at the label, right? They're just, that's pretty, I'll try it.
After I'd finished with Villa Mount Eden and Con Creek, well, I didn't really finish. I got a better job offer after playing bocce ball. I was a part of a bocce ball league that was nearby.
Of course there was.
Yeah, I was still trying to make friends and meet people in California, and so sometimes if you're just working all the time, it's hard to find an outlet to do that. And so I got into running, competitive running, which was good. And I met some people that way. And then at work, we had some people that wanted to get a bocce ball team going, which is just a fun drinking game, basically. There was a league that was taking place at a nearby winery. And so we would go once every Tuesday night or something like that. And I think our team name was We've Got Balls or something like that. I don't know, something dumb. We ended up meeting a lot of other people from that. And one of the people I met was this guy, Tim Thornhill. Tim and his family had just moved out from Houston, Texas. He wanted to get his family together because they, his parents and his siblings had kind of moved all over the United States doing their different things. His notion and his idea was to get the family back together again by buying a vineyard. So they looked around quite a few different places and looked in Napa, ultimately decided in Mendocino County, which is kind of the northern part of California, where grape growing is done. You get much further north and it's just a lot of redwoods, and then you're eventually in Oregon. And it worked. He got his parents to move out, and they lived on this beautiful vineyard property called La Ribera that was right on the eastern side of the Russian River. And it was 150 acres of grapes and just a beautiful spot. And I ended up meeting him and kind of hearing his story, and we struck kind of a kinship between it, because he's like, yeah, you took a risk and you went to a new area as well. And this wine world is fascinating. I eventually heard through the grapevine, so to say, that he and his family had bought Parducci Winery after a few years of just owning the vineyard, and became partners with a guy named Paul Dolan, who is one of the real organic, pioneers in organic and biodynamic wine growing. Sure. So eschewing a lot of the chemicals and other things that are used oftentimes in the vineyard in favor for a more back to the earth sort of style and less invasive chemicals. And I'd always had an interest in environmental stances, because my degree was actually in environmental geology that led me to be in the Peace Corps and trying to do some things that trying to leave the planet better than what you had it, And so there was a job opening that came right at harvest time, which is a difficult time to jump into a job because there's not much time to get trained. You just kind of go in full bore.
Right. Yeah.
And I ended up meeting the head winemaker, this guy Bob Swain, who had been there for a number of years. And Bob had experience with Gallo and Clos de Val and Newton and wineries that had very, very good reputations. And he was making some phenomenal wines, but kind of under the radar because Mendocino is not as well known. Got to taste some of the wines and I had an immense amount of respect for them. And that with the organic approach that they were starting to change the winery towards, I had a great conversation with my stepfather who was out visiting me at the time. And I said, I've got a good job where I'm at right now, but there seems to be maybe a better opportunity going to this other place. And so we got out the card and just pros and cons, and it was all pros. So I accepted the position. And harvest was 64 days straight without a day off. And it was 16-hour days. And
wait, did you say 64 days?
Yeah, 64 days straight without a day off. That's how harvest is sometimes. And that was the harvest was 2004, which was known to be a very intense and kind of compact vintage. It wasn't spread out between the varieties. Like you would oftentimes see Sauvignon Blanc come in maybe in mid-August, and then the other varieties like Chardonnay and then Pinot Noir would come along, and then you might start to see some of your Rhone varieties and your Bordeaux varieties like Cabernet and Syrah and Petit Syrah later on throughout the year, and it gets stretched out sometimes over 2.5 months. 2004 wasn't that way. It was all at one time. So it was an incredibly intense time. It destroyed some of my relationships with friends, and I probably burned through 2 girlfriends at that time as well. Dating a winemaker during harvest, they just call them harvest widows. And I think it goes both ways because there's plenty of women in the wine industry as well. So you just don't get to see your loved ones all that much. So it can be a real strain.
I mean, the days are long. Yeah. Is it like a sun up, sundown thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cause you always want to get in super early because the wineries, some of their biggest expenses are refrigeration. So if you're doing a lot of your activities early on in the day when the temperatures are the temperature is lower, there's less energy draw at that time. And then you
yeah.
also want to bring in the fruit very, very cool if you're bringing in harvest, because there's techniques that you're utilizing to extract the best color and the best aroma and flavor. You really need those grapes to come in cool. So I took the position with them, and it was very, very intense. I think it was Halloween, which is typically when things start to really settle down, thankfully. And all the grapes were in at that time, and they were just going through the finishing touches on fermentation. And you start to get your head above water a little bit from the work fame, and like, all right, there's still things to do for life, and let's go out and go see some friends. I got back to being lonely again, and there was nobody there with me. The girlfriend I had, we'd broken up several weeks before. Lo and behold, this beautiful girl shows up at work, and she's blonde and vivacious and funny, and she's got some sass to her. I couldn't take my eyes off of her. But the asterisk with that was that was Tim's daughter, Tim Thornhill's daughter. So I'm not into soap opera. Yeah, I'm not into soap operas at all, but I think that's something from a soap opera. It's like, yeah, you don't date the boss's daughter.
Don't date the boss's daughter. That is it's a rule.
Yeah.
Not just winemakers. I think that's for like everybody.
Yeah, well, I broke it. So we were interested in each other and struck up a romance, and we tried to keep it under wraps for a long, long time, which I thought we did a pretty good job of. And then one day I show up at the winery on a Saturday, and this is after harvest is over. So it's kind of, I had some things I just needed to do. And there was Mr. Thornhill there, and he's Texan and can be a kind of an intimidating person sometimes. And he was there, and he's like, hey, why don't you jump in the truck with me? I want to have a talk with you about some stuff. And I was like, okay, sure. Where are we going? He's like, well, we're going to go down to the wastewater pond. And so the wastewater pond is where, you got to rinse
That's where you hide the body.
Yeah. It's a good place to hide a body.
Yeah.
So he told me he knew what was up, and he asked what my intentions were. And I think I passed the test, and he gave approval to the relationship. And fast forward, Kate and I have been married since 2006, and we got 2 beautiful boys. It's been a fantastic life, man. And it still happens though every year, where it'll be during harvest, and I've done 21 harvests now, I guess. She always says, well, when's it going to be done?
Yeah, right.
Be done when the grapes are going to be done. So,
right.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something then. What wine am I buying tonight? If I'm going like right now, what's your bottle? What's the thing you're thinking about? And you're like, because you'd go to the store and buy wine, don't you? I mean, even though you're a winemaker.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, it's so right now it's the middle of August. It was stinking hot today. It got up to like 97 or 98 degrees.
It's so friggin' hot here.
Yeah. So when that situation, I kind of steer away from the big and heavy reds, and a white wine is just refreshing and kind of cuts through that heat. So what I've been enjoying lately is Viognier. I think it's an incredible variety. It has so much personality. It's a white wine that can actually age. I've always told Kate that if I was to make a wine for her, it would be a Viognier, because they're beautiful all the time, and they're just absolutely fascinating and captivating. And that's something that, I don't know, I've been reaching for lately. And there's a lot of different styles on how Viognier can be made, but I've been preferring the ones that have come from a region out of France. It's near the Rhone Valley, or within the Rhone Valley, called Condrieu. And they make these Viogniers that they aren't heavily accented by oak. There's a little bit of oak that's there to complement the fruit, but they're just this wonderful peach and honeysuckle, beeswax, honeyed sort of elements that are to the wine. And they make you think it's going to be sweet, but they're perfectly dry, but there's so much viscosity and body and volume to these wines that you just can't help and just be cerebral about it and think about it. And it's like an onion that you just keep peeling back layers from. And so that's a glass I like to put down and then come back to again later, because as the wine tends to move from maybe your refrigerator temperature or 55 degrees, whatever it is you had it at, there's going to be different things that are going to emerge as it starts to slowly rise to getting closer to room temperature. And so they're wines that you can just really, really trip out on. And I love Viognier. It was something I made when I was with Mendocino Wine Company in Parducci,
Right.
that we grew on the property. It was something we also made while I was at Maui. And it was a variety that did very, very well there, and it was just beautiful fruit.
Yeah, I've had
And
a few
then,
bottles of that. It's good.
and then when I moved to Sonoma to be at Valley of the Moon, we played around with a bit of Viognier as well. And now that I'm with Beringer, one of the programs that or brands that they have is Chateau Saint Jean, which is just a fantastic winery with an incredible winemaker, Margot. That's been just one of the highlights of Sonoma County, and they do Viognier there. Also, Stag's Leap Winery, which is part of the family that Beringer is involved with, and they make a Viognier as well. And they're made in two very different styles, but I don't know. It'll be fun to be able to pick the winemakers' brains on how they come about to forming and working through their product.
Right.
Which I just love. It's going to be an incredible opportunity to learn more things, and I just strive for that. There's just so much more to learn.
I want to put a link to that bottle that Cardew. Would you say the French one was?
Condru.
Yeah. Okay, from the Rhone Valley. Okay, well, I'm going to put a link in the show notes for that so people can, if they can go find it or they can take a look at it. And I'm definitely going to kind of hunt around and see. I had some of the Viognier you made. It's so good, man.
Good. Yeah, I wish I had brought some more of that back with me, but it's such a small amount is made. It goes pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. And if people can't find Condru, you can at least find some Viognier from other producers. Parducci makes a very nice one as well. And then some of the other kind of Rhone producers, because it's a Rhone variety that's can be grown very well in California. Tablas Creek, probably find one from them. And then, of course, the Chateau Saint Jean, if you can find that. Also a very, very nice wine.
Sounds amazing. Okay, well, we're gonna wrap this up, and what we do at the end of the show is that our guests get to give their blessing. This show this podcast is about positivity. It's about leaving people with something new, some ideas, some thought, something that people have. So if you'd like to give a blessing to our listeners, now is the time.
To the listener that's out there, may you always be blessed to experience and see nature with the same eyes and wonderment that you did when you were a 5-year-old kid.
Everybody, go down to Beringer Wineries in Napa. Find Mark. He's out in the field somewhere. Ask him as many questions as you like.
Bring it on.
Yeah, man.
There's no bad question.
Yeah,
the only bad question is the one you don't ask.
Exactly.
So it's always a chance to learn.
Cool, Mark. Thanks, man. Really, really
David,
appreciate you taking the time.
Great talking with you, man.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll give Kate and the boys a hug for me, okay? And we'll talk to you again very soon.
All right. Do the same for your boys and for your lovely wife as well.
All right. Thanks, brother.
Cheers, bro.
The Voyagers podcast is produced by Sugar Sled Productions and recorded in Kula on the island of Maui. It's hosted by myself, David Glenn Taylor. If you like what you heard and you're interested in becoming a sponsor or in supporting this podcast, go to www.voyagerspodcast.com and click the link to become a Patreon supporter. And to become a sponsor, email us at info@voyagerspodcast.com. For next week, we're moving from the lush vineyards of Napa Valley to the epic landscape of Denali in Alaska, where we find a chef cooking unbelievable food 1,000 feet up above a glacier. He cooked for the stars, and now he cooks under the stars. Delicious Dave Thorne, next week on the Voyagers podcast. Mahalo for listening, friends.